Aunt weaponizes my inheritance until a public letter uncovers the lies. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. My aunt smiled, holding my rent check just out of reach, and said, "Dump him today, and I'll sign it." I stared at the manicured hand gripping the piece of paper that stood between me and eviction. I'm Maya. I'm 24 years old, and on paper, I am a multimillionaire. But in reality, I am standing in the foyer of a sprawling, newly renovated country club mansion, begging for the basic cost of living while my shoes soak through with rainwater from my 2-mile walk from the bus stop. 5 years ago, my world violently ended. My parents were killed in a horrific highway pileup on their way to a weekend getaway. The grief was a physical weight that crushed the air out of my lungs for months. I was a 19-year-old college sophomore, suddenly orphaned and completely alone. My parents were incredibly successful architects, and they left behind an estate worth nearly $6 million. But I haven't seen a single, unconditional penny of it. My father's sister, Aunt Beatrice, stepped in as the executor of the trust. She promised the family she would take care of me, shielding me from the vultures and the stress of financial management while I mourned. Have you ever watched someone steal your life while demanding you thank them for it? That is exactly what Beatrice did. She weaponized my grief, locking my entire inheritance behind an iron gate of impossible standards and humiliating demands. She controlled where I lived, what I studied, and now, who I was allowed to date. If I didn't comply, the funds were frozen. I was working 2 grueling jobs, one as a barista opening the shop at 4 a.m., and another doing data entry late into the night, just to afford the heating bill in my cramped, leaky apartment. I swallowed my pride, looking at her smug, perfectly powdered face, and nodded. I agreed to dump my supportive boyfriend just so I wouldn't end up sleeping on the streets. I took the check, my hands shaking with a toxic mixture of shame and absolute hatred. She patted my cheek, telling me my parents would be so proud of her guidance. I walked out the door, entirely unaware that a massive reckoning was already silently brewing. The day the will was read is burned into my memory. It was just 3 weeks after the funeral. I sat in a cold, sterile conference room at a downtown law firm, clutching a tissue, my eyes swollen and bloodshot. Beatrice sat across from me, wearing a somber black dress and an expression of grim duty. The lawyer handed her a thick file. Beatrice cleared her throat and began to read a supplementary document she claimed my parents had drafted just months before their deaths. It was called the Morality and Maturation Clause. According to Beatrice, my parents were terrified that sudden wealth would ruin my work ethic. Therefore, the trust of $6 million was not to be dispersed to me at age 21 as I had always assumed. Instead, Beatrice was given absolute, total discretion over every single payout until I turned 35. But it was worse than just a delay. To receive even a modest monthly stipend for college textbooks or rent, I had to meet her exact criteria. I had to maintain a 3.8 GPA in a business or law program. I had to submit itemized receipts for every single purchase. I was forbidden from living with roommates of questionable moral character, which essentially meant anyone Beatrice didn't personally vet and approve. And any sign of reckless behavior would result in a complete financial cutoff. I was completely stunned. My parents were warm, creative, and liberal people who supported my passion for art, history, and education. They had never once spoken to me like this. They had never used money as a weapon. But I was 19, drowning in grief, and entirely intimidated by the legal jargon Beatrice kept throwing in my face. When I weakly questioned the strictness of the rules, Beatrice sighed deeply, looking at me with profound disappointment. "Maya, darling, this is what they wanted. They knew you were fragile and prone to making emotional, foolish decisions. I am simply carrying out their dying wishes to protect you from yourself." I believed her because I was too broken to fight back. I signed the acknowledgement forms without fully reading them, sealing my own fate. I had just handed the keys to my entire future directly to a smiling monster. Over the next 5 years, the golden cage Beatrice built around me shrank smaller and smaller. By the time I was 24, my life felt like an exhausting, endless performance for an audience of one. Every single financial request was a grueling battle. Last semester, I begged her to release enough funds to cover my tuition for a master's degree in art therapy. It was my absolute dream, a way to help grieving children process trauma the way I had tried to do. Beatrice denied the request entirely. Art therapy isn't a real career, Maya. She sneered over the phone from her country club patio. Your parents wanted you to be successful, not a starving artist playing with finger paints. Switch your major to corporate finance, and we will talk. Until then, the bank is closed. So, I kept working my 2 minimum wage jobs just to pay for my basic groceries, while officially being the beneficiary of a $6 million trust. The injustice of it tasted like ash in my mouth. But the most agonizing part was watching how Beatrice and her son, Leo, lived. Before my parents died, Beatrice was a mid-level regional manager drowning in credit card debt. Leo was a college dropout who spent his time playing video games in her basement. Now, Beatrice had purchased a sprawling, historic estate on the edge of town, complete with a tennis court and a staff of 3. She claimed she used her own savvy investments to buy it, but she had never invested a dime before 2021. Leo suddenly had a high-paying, vaguely defined consulting position at a firm owned by one of Beatrice's new country club friends. Text message from Leo, Tuesday, 3:14 p.m. Hey cuz, Mom said you were begging for rent money again. Maybe stop buying expensive lattes and get a real job? Just bought a Rolex. Life is good. I sat on the floor of my apartment, staring at a massive, brown water stain on my ceiling, holding my phone with white-knuckled fists. The suffocating control was designed to break my spirit entirely. The carefully constructed illusion of her generosity was about to spectacularly crack wide open. The breaking point didn't come with a dramatic argument. It arrived with a loud, grinding metallic screech. It was a freezing Tuesday morning, and I was driving my battered, 15-year-old sedan to my early shift at the coffee shop. Suddenly, the transmission completely blew out on the interstate. Smoke poured from the hood as I wrestled the car to the shoulder, my heart pounding in my throat. The mechanic's estimate was brutal, $2,500. It was money I simply did not have. If I didn't have a car, I couldn't get to the coffee shop at 4 a.m. If I lost that job, I couldn't pay my rent. Desperate, I called Beatrice. I laid out the situation, practically hyperventilating, begging for a tiny emergency disbursement. Maya, this is exactly what I mean by financial irresponsibility, she lectured, her tone dripping with fake sympathy. If you had been saving your wages instead of living beyond your means, you could handle this. Bailing you out teaches you nothing. Your parents would want you to learn resilience. She hung up on me. I spent the next 3 hours crying in the freezing cab of a tow truck. I had to take out a predatory payday loan just to keep my job. The very next afternoon, I was walking to my second job when a blindingly bright yellow car almost clipped me at a crosswalk. I jumped back, looking up to see who was driving. It was Leo. He was behind the wheel of a brand-new, top-of-the-line Porsche 911. He revved the engine loudly, smirked at me through the window, and sped off toward the country club. The contrast was physically nauseating. I was going into severe, high-interest debt just to fix a rusted transmission so I could serve coffee, while my unemployed cousin was driving a $100,000 sports car. The math had never made sense, but seeing that yellow Porsche violently snapped something inside my brain. The grief and the guilt that had kept me docile evaporated in an instant. I realized my aunt was not protecting my future, she was actively stealing it. The universe has a funny way of handing you the truth exactly when you are finally ready to look at it. 2 days after the Porsche incident, I was checking my rusted mailbox. Mixed in with the junk mail and past-due utility bills was a thick, cream-colored envelope. The address was my apartment, but the name on the front was Beatrice's. She had occasionally used my address for minor, trivial things years ago, but this looked different. It bore the return address of a high-end, boutique wealth management firm located in the Cayman Islands. A normal person would have marked it return to sender. I locked my apartment door, grabbed a kitchen knife, and sliced the envelope open. Inside was an annual tax reporting summary for an offshore account. The primary account holder was Beatrice. The secondary beneficiary was Leo. But it was the account balance that made the blood completely drain from my face. $2.4 million. Have you ever felt the ground completely vanish beneath your feet? I stared at the string of numbers until they blurred together. Beatrice had always claimed she was just a middle-class woman doing her best before my parents died. There was absolutely no way she had amassed nearly $2.5 million in offshore assets legitimately. I dug out the shoebox where I kept the sparse, heavily redacted annual trust summaries Beatrice legally had to provide me. I compared the dates of the massive deposits on the Cayman statement to the dates of my trust's administrative fee deductions. The correlation was terrifyingly precise. Every time a large chunk of money disappeared from my parents' estate under the vague guise of legal fees or portfolio restructuring, an almost identical amount popped up in the offshore account 2 weeks later. She wasn't just skimming off the top to pay herself an executor fee. My loving aunt was systematically bleeding my parents' entire $6 million estate completely dry. The following Sunday, Beatrice hosted her annual welcome summer family barbecue at her lavish estate. It was a sickening display of stolen wealth. Caterers carried silver trays of oysters, a live jazz band played by the massive swimming pool, and 50 of our relatives lounged in designer clothes. Beatrice held court on the patio, wearing a diamond tennis bracelet, soaking up the family's admiration. "Maya, dear, be a good girl and fetch me another mimosa," she ordered as I walked past, treating me like part of the hired help. I smiled tightly, took her empty crystal glass, and walked inside the massive house. But I didn't go to the kitchen. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs as I slipped past the caterers and headed straight down the long, carpeted hallway toward Beatrice's private home office. I knew the room was strictly off-limits. She kept the heavy oak door locked at all times, claiming it was for client confidentiality. But when Leo was a teenager, he once drunkenly bragged to me about where his mother kept the spare key to the house, hidden inside the false bottom of a decorative potted fern in the hallway. My hands shook so badly I could barely sift through the dirt. Finally, my fingers brushed against cold metal. I pulled out a small brass key. I glanced over my shoulder, terrified one of the caterers or a wandering uncle would spot me. The hallway was completely empty. I slid the key into the heavy oak door. It clicked open with a heavy thud. I slipped inside and gently shut it behind me, plunging into the dark, mahogany-paneled nerve center of Beatrice's fraudulent empire. The room smelled of expensive leather, expensive perfume, and dark secrets. I immediately rushed to the massive antique desk sitting in the center of the room, my breathing shallow and fast. If I was caught in this room, she would legally destroy my entire life forever. I began frantically pulling open the heavy desk drawers. Most were filled with mundane country club directories and stationery. But the bottom right drawer was different. It was locked. I grabbed a heavy brass letter opener off the desk and wedged it into the cheap lock mechanism, prying with all my frantic, desperate strength. With a sharp snap, the wood splintered and the drawer popped open. Inside lay a disorganized mountain of manila folders. I started ripping through them. I found fake invoices from shell companies, property deeds in Leo's name, and more offshore banking statements. The sheer volume of her financial crimes was staggering. But buried at the very bottom of the drawer, hidden beneath a stack of old tax returns, was something that made my heart completely stop. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed with age. My breath hitched in my throat as I traced the elegant, sweeping handwriting on the front. It was my mother's handwriting. I would recognize those perfect, architect-trained loops anywhere. The text simply read, "For Maya, upon turning 21. To be delivered immediately." My hands trembled violently as I picked it up. The heavy wax seal on the back was still perfectly intact. Beatrice had never opened it. She had simply buried it in the dark, intending for it to rot away forever. I was 24 years old. This letter was supposed to be given to me 3 years ago. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of the jazz band and my family laughing out by the pool, entirely oblivious to the monumental betrayal hiding just a few walls away. I didn't care if Beatrice walked in and caught me. I had to know what my mother wanted to tell me from beyond the grave. I slid my thumb under the heavy flap, breaking the aged wax seal. I pulled out 3 pages of elegant handwriting that instantly shattered my entire known reality. I unfolded the delicate pages, my tears immediately blurring the ink. "My dearest Maya," the letter began. "If you are reading this, you are 21, and you are officially stepping into your future. Your father and I are so incredibly proud of the woman you have become." The letter was filled with paragraphs of deep, agonizingly beautiful love and maternal advice. but it was the second page that made my blood run entirely cold. Today, the entirety of our estate and the trust fund officially transfers to your sole, unconditional control. There are no rules, Maya. There are no stipulations. We built this wealth for you to use freely, to explore the world, to make mistakes, and to chase your beautiful dreams in art or whatever you choose. I stopped breathing. The morality and maturation clause, the draconian rules that had kept me a starving, groveling prisoner for 5 years, was a complete and utter fiction. Beatrice had forged the supplementary documents. The letter continued, delivering the final, devastating blow. A word of caution, my sweet girl. Your Aunt Beatrice has always struggled with bitter jealousy and a terrifying greed. We appointed her as executor only for your minor years, but do not let her maintain control a single day past your 21st birthday. She will try to manipulate you. Stand firm. My mother had known. She had tried to warn me. Beatrice had legally stolen my voice, weaponized my profound grief, and used my dead mother's memory to gaslight me into absolute submission. I sat on the floor of the dark office, clutching the pages to my chest as a silent, violent sob racked my body. The sheer cruelty of stealing a grieving orphan's inheritance was unfathomable. But to use my parents' memory to make me feel worthless while she bought mansions? That was pure, unadulterated evil. The crushing sadness vanished entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating, and terrifyingly focused absolute rage. I moved with frantic, mechanical precision. I pulled out my phone and took high-resolution photos of every single page of my mother's letter, making sure the metadata and timestamps were perfectly clear. Then, I photographed the fake shell company invoices, the offshore account statements, and Leo's newly signed Porsche title, which was funded directly by a wire transfer from the estate administrative fund. I carefully placed the original letter in my bag, rearranged the files to look undisturbed, pushed the splintered drawer shut, and slipped out of the office. I walked back out to the sunny patio, handed Beatrice her mimosa, and smiled. First thing Monday morning, I skipped my shift at the coffee shop and walked straight into the downtown office of Mr. Henderson. He was a retired, fiercely ethical accountant who had been a dear friend to my father decades ago. He was one of the few people Beatrice had aggressively pushed out of my life after the funeral. I sat across from his messy desk and laid out my printed photos and the original letter. Mr. Henderson adjusted his thick glasses, reading in absolute silence. As he cross-referenced the offshore transfers with the fake invoices, his face turned a mottled, furious red. "Maya," he whispered, his voice trembling with quiet outrage. "This isn't just skimming. This is grand larceny. She has drained nearly $3 million of your principal. She used your father's life work to buy her country club estate in cash, and she used your tuition money to buy her spoiled son a luxury sports car." He looked up at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "We go to the authorities right now. We lock down the accounts, freeze her assets, and we put her in prison," Mr. Henderson stated firmly, reaching for his desk phone. I placed my hand gently over his, stopping him. A quiet legal battle was exactly what Beatrice would want. She would drag it out for years. No, I wanted something much worse. I wanted her to lose her reputation, her family, and her perfectly crafted public facade. Beatrice had spent the last 5 years meticulously crafting a narrative to our entire extended family. She painted herself as the long-suffering, saintly matriarch who sacrificed her own peace to manage her wild, ungrateful, financially illiterate niece. Our aunts, uncles, and cousins all believed her. They looked at me with pity and whispered about my troubled nature at family gatherings. If I just filed a quiet lawsuit, Beatrice would spin it. She would play the victim, claiming a misunderstanding or a bad investment, and half the family would probably still take her side. I couldn't allow that. I needed an audience. I needed a stage where she couldn't escape, couldn't lie, and couldn't hide behind expensive lawyers. The annual memorial dinner for my parents was exactly 2 weeks away. Every year, on the anniversary of the crash, Beatrice hosted a massive, catered dinner in the grand dining room of her exclusive country club. She invited over 50 relatives and close family friends. It was her favorite night of the year, a chance to stand in front of everyone, shed crocodile tears, and accept their endless praise for keeping the family together during a tragedy. It was the perfect trap. I texted Beatrice later that afternoon, adopting my usual, submissive tone. Text message from Maya. Aunt Beatrice, I know I've been difficult lately. I'd love to attend the memorial dinner this year. I was hoping I could even give a short speech to thank you for everything you've done for me. Text message from Beatrice. Oh, Maya, I'm so glad you are finally maturing. Yes, a public thank you would be very appropriate. I'll add you to the schedule. I spent the next 14 days meticulously preparing with Mr. Henderson. He contacted a forensic accountant and a ruthless estate lawyer to prepare the asset freezing injunctions, timing them to execute the exact morning after the dinner. Meanwhile, I went to a high-end print shop and made 50 glossy, full-color copies of the offshore bank statements, the fake invoices, and my mother's handwritten letter. I bound them in sleek black folders. The stage was set, the evidence was printed, and the executioner was ready to strike. The evening of the memorial dinner was unseasonably warm. The grand dining room of the country club was dripping with ostentatious wealth, crystal chandeliers, towering floral centerpieces, and a string quartet playing softly in the corner. 50 of my relatives sat at the long tables, sipping expensive champagne that had been secretly purchased with my parents' blood money. I arrived wearing a modest, dark dress, carrying a large, heavy leather tote bag over my shoulder. Beatrice greeted me at the door, draped in silk, her neck glittering with diamonds. Maya, darling, you look acceptable, she said, kissing the air near my cheek. Remember, keep your speech brief and focused on gratitude. No one wants to hear a depressing rant tonight. Don't worry, Aunt Beatrice, I replied, my voice completely deadpan. I'm going to give them a speech they will never, ever forget. Leo walked by, casually tossing his Porsche keys onto a silver tray. He sneered at me. Try not to embarrass us, cousin, he muttered, grabbing a flute of champagne. I took my seat near the back of the room, quietly observing the sickening charade. For an hour, I watched Beatrice work the room, accepting condolences and soaking up the family's blind adoration. You are such an angel, Bea, my great-aunt Clara gushed loudly. Raising that girl, dealing with that massive estate, your brother would be so proud of your sacrifice. I gripped the leather handles of my tote bag so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my mind was completely, terrifyingly clear. Finally, Beatrice tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon, signaling the start of the speeches. The room fell silent as she stepped up to the ornate wooden podium at the front of the room. She delivered a sickeningly sweet, 10-minute monologue about grief, family duty, and the heavy burden of managing my life. She dabbed at dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. And now, Beatrice announced, beaming benevolently, my niece Maya would like to say a few words of thanks. I grabbed my heavy bag, stood up, and slowly walked toward the podium to destroy her. I stepped up to the podium, the microphone picking up the slight tremble in my breath. 50 faces looked up at me with a mixture of polite pity and mild annoyance. Beatrice stood off to the side, her hands clasped, wearing a smug, expectant smile. I didn't look at her. I reached into my bag and pulled out the original, yellowed envelope. Aunt Beatrice asked me to speak tonight about gratitude. I began, my voice echoing loudly through the silent, glittering ballroom. But I realized that my mother already wrote the perfect speech for this occasion. I found a letter she left for me, a letter that was hidden in a locked safe for 3 years. Beatrice's smug smile instantly vanished. Her posture went completely rigid. Maya, what are you doing? She hissed under her breath, taking a panicked step toward the podium. I ignored her, unfolding the fragile pages. My dearest Maya, I read aloud, projecting my voice so every single person in the back row could hear. Today, the entirety of our estate and the trust fund officially transfers to your sole, unconditional control. There are no rules, Maya. There are no stipulations. A collective, shocked gasp rippled through the dining room. Relatives exchanged highly confused, alarmed glances. Maya, stop this instantly. You are having a mental breakdown. Beatrice shouted, her voice shrill and echoing loudly. She reached for the microphone. I violently shoved her hand away. She warned me. I continued reading, my voice rising in power and volume. Your Aunt Beatrice has always struggled with bitter jealousy and a terrifying greed. Do not let her maintain control past your 21st birthday. She will try to manipulate you. I read the final line of my mother's warning, staring directly into the crowd of stunned faces. I drop the letter onto the podium. For 5 years, Beatrice told you all that my parents left a strict morality clause. For 5 years, she forced me to work 2 minimum-wage jobs while begging for rent money. I reached into my bag and pulled out the stack of black folders. I hurled the heavy folders onto the front tables, letting the undeniable financial truth spill out. Open them. I yelled to my uncles and aunts sitting in the front row. Look at the bank statements. Look at the offshore Cayman Island accounts in her name. Look at the title for Leo's $100,000 Porsche, paid for directly by my parents' estate. The room erupted into absolute, unmitigated chaos. Great Aunt Clara opened a folder, tracing the highlighted multi-million-dollar transfers with a trembling finger. "B, what is this?" she gasped, looking up with profound horror. "It's a forgery. She made it all up because she's greedy and insane." Beatrice shrieked, her face a terrifying shade of purple. The elegant, refined country club matron was completely gone, replaced by a cornered, frantic animal. She lunged at the tables, trying to physically rip the folders out of her family's hands. Leo jumped out of his chair, his face pale. "Mom, what the hell did you do?" he stammered, realizing his lavish lifestyle was built on highly illegal, radioactive ground. "Shut up, Leo," she screamed at her own son. But the evidence was completely undeniable. The dates, the signatures, the routing numbers, it was all there in high-definition black and white. Uncle Robert, a retired judge, stood up and threw his napkin on the table in disgust. "You stole from an orphan girl, Beatrice. You stole from your own dead brother," he said, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. The murmurs of the crowd turned into loud, angry shouts. People were standing up, pushing their chairs back, completely disgusted by the monster they had been praising for half a decade. I stood at the podium, watching her entire fraudulent kingdom burn to the ground in real time. Beatrice fell to her knees in the middle of the dining room floor, sobbing hysterically, desperately clawing at Uncle Robert's suit jacket, begging him to listen to her. He stepped away from her as if she carried a deadly plague. The string quartet had completely stopped playing, leaving only the sound of Beatrice's pathetic, frantic wailing echoing off the crystal chandeliers. I calmly packed my mother's letter into my bag and walked out into the cool night. The very next morning, at exactly 8 a.m., my legal team dropped the hammer. Mr. Henderson's aggressive estate lawyers filed massive injunctions in federal court, instantly freezing all of Beatrice's domestic bank accounts, placing an emergency lien on her sprawling country club mansion, and legally blocking any access to her offshore Cayman funds. The fallout was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. Our entire extended family completely cut Beatrice off. Nobody returned her frantic phone calls. Nobody offered to help pay for her high-priced defense attorneys. Within 2 weeks, the repo men showed up at her estate and towed Leo's bright yellow Porsche right out of the driveway while he watched from the porch, completely powerless. Because Beatrice had used wire transfers to move the stolen estate funds across international borders into the offshore account, the case immediately triggered a federal investigation for major wire fraud and grand larceny. The local prosecutors were practically salivating over the undeniable paper trail I had meticulously handed them. Beatrice was forced to sell off her diamonds, her designer clothes, and her antique furniture just to afford a basic criminal defense lawyer who told her she was facing up to 15 years in federal prison. She tried to reach out to me once, sending a pathetic, tear-stained letter begging for a private settlement and claiming she had made a terrible mistake out of grief. I didn't even open the envelope. I simply handed it directly to my lawyers to add to the mounting pile of devastating evidence against her. She had shown me zero mercy when I was freezing, grieving, and begging for my own money to fix my car. I owed her absolutely nothing. The legal process of unwinding her massive, tangled web of shell companies and offshore accounts took several grueling months, but the court officially removed her as executor and granted me full, immediate, unconditional access to the remainder of my parents' trust fund. The golden cage she had built around me was finally, completely, and permanently shattered into dust. It has been 3 years since that explosive night at the country club memorial dinner. Beatrice recently accepted a brutal plea deal to avoid a massive public trial. She is currently serving an 8-year sentence in a minimum security federal prison, entirely bankrupt and completely alienated from everyone who ever loved her. Leo works a minimum wage retail job, forced to finally live the reality his mother had maliciously tried to force upon me. As for me, I finally got to breathe. Reclaiming my stolen inheritance wasn't just about the millions of dollars. It was about reclaiming the beautiful, loving memory of my parents that Beatrice had tried to poison. I paid off my debts, quit my exhausting barista job, and fully funded my master's degree in art therapy. I now run a fully funded community center program that uses art to help young orphans process their grief and trauma, doing exactly what my parents would have wanted with their legacy. Healing from that level of profound family betrayal takes an immense amount of time and intense therapy. I had to learn how to trust people again, and how to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop. But I also learned an incredibly valuable lesson about power. Toxic, greedy people thrive in the shadows. They rely on your silence, your shame, and your desire to keep the peace to maintain their control. The absolute worst thing you can do to a manipulator is to expose their secrets to the blinding light of day. If you are trapped in a golden cage, controlled by someone who weaponizes your vulnerability, stop begging for their permission to exist. Gather your proof, stand your ground, and refuse to be quiet. Do not let them rewrite your history or dictate your worth. You are stronger than the lies they tell about you. The truth is the most devastating, powerful weapon in the world, and once you finally find the courage to wield it, no amount of money or manipulation can ever stop you. I finally found my voice, and I will never let anyone silence me ever again.